Before the arrival of Spanish explorers in the Philippine society were composed of barangays consisting of 30 to 100 families ruled by datus or magino. So the ruler governed the respective barangays or confederacies of barangays in accordance with established laws, customs, and traditions. So the people carried on trade among themselves and their oriental neighbors. They had systems of writing consisting of syllabaries. They had their own religious beliefs and practices as well as their own standard of morality and their own sense of value. So good day everyone, I am Bethelle, Riczie, Reponte. Today we will be presenting the customs of Filipino Pre-Hispanic society. So the objective of our presentation is to describe the customs of the early Filipino society in regards to the religious practices, social classes, and their system of government and political costumes during the pre-Hispanic period based on the writings of Miguel de Loarca, Pedro Chirino, Fray Juan de Plasencia, Miguel de Loarca, and Francisco Colin.
Religion. On matters of religious practices of pre-Hispanic Filipino society, we will look to the excerpt from Relación de las Islas Filipinas by Pedro Chirino. According to Chirino, all their government and religion is founded on tradition and on custom introduced by the devil himself, who spoke to them through their idols and ministers of this. They preserve it in songs which they know by heart and learned when they were children. In this barbarous song, they relate the fabulous genealogies and vain deeds of their gods, among whom they set up one as the chief and superior of them all. This deity the Tagalogs call Bethelle, which means God the creator or maker. The Visayans call him Lawan, which denotes antiquity. These songs relate to the creation of the world, the origin of human race, the deluge, paradise, punishment, and other invisible things relating 1,000 absurdities. In short, they recognize invisible spirits and another life. Also, demons, the enemies of man, of whom they were in abject fear from the evils and dread which these caused them. According to Chirino, one of their comrades converted many of them by means of a well-painted picture of hell. Their idolatry is in word, as with many other nations, an adoration and deification of their ancestors, especially of those who distinguished themselves through valiant deeds, or cruelties, or obscene and lewd acts. It was a general practice for anyone who could successfully do so to attribute divinity to his old father when the latter died. In memory of these departed ones, they keep their little idols, some of stone, wood, bone, ivory, or a crocodile's teeth, others of gold. They call this larawan, which signifies an idol, an image, or a statue. And in their necessities they have recourse to this, offering to them barbarous sacrifices.
So, the second primary source that describes the religious practices of the early Filipinos is an excerpt from Relation of the Worship of the Tagalogs, their gods and their rituals and superstitions by Fray Juan de Plasencia. So, Juan de Plasencia was responsible for the foundation of various towns in Luzon, particularly in Laguna and Tayabas areas, and the conversion of their inhabitants to Catholicism. So, he was also the author of numerous religious books such as the Doctrina of Christiana, the first book printed in the Philippines. So, considered as a zealous missionary, Plasencia denied himself as luxurious and was known to be the defender of the natives from the Spanish officials, which resulted in the Manila Synod of 1582. So, Plasencia described the religious practices of the Filipinos as follows. In all the villages or in other parts of the Filipinas islands, there are no temples consecrated to the performing of sacrifices, the adoration of their idols, or the general practice of idolatry. It is true that they have the name called Simba'a, they have the place called Simbahan, which means a temple or place of adoration, but this is because formerly, when they wished to celebrate a festival, which they called Pandot or worship, they celebrated it in a large house of a chief. There they had constructed, for the purpose of sheltering the assembled people, a temporary shed on each side of the house with a roof called sibi to protect the people from the wet when it rained. Among their many idols, there were one called Badhala, whom they especially worshipped. The title seemed to signify all-powerful or maker of all things. They also worshipped the sun, which, on account of its beauty, is almost universally respected and honored by heathens. They worshipped too the moon, especially when it was new, which means they held great rejoicings, adoring it and bidding it welcome. Some of them also adored the stars, although they did not know them by their names, as the Spaniards and other nations know the planets, with the exception of the morning star, which they called Tala. In account of the sacrifices offered to their gods, Plasencia described them as follows. Their manner of offering sacrifice was to proclaim a feast and offer to the devil what they had to eat. This was done in front of the idol, which they anoint with fragrant perfumes such as musk and civet, or gum of the storax tree and other odoriferous woods, and praise it in a poetic song sung by the officiating priest, male or female, whom they called katulunan. The participants made responses to the song, beseeching the idol to favor them with those things of which they were in need, and generally by offering repeated healths, they all became intoxicated. In some of their idolatries, they were accustomed to place a good piece of cloth doubled over the idol, and over the cloth a chain or a large gold ring, thus worshipping the devil without having sight of him. So Plasencia also gives us the reason as to why he thinks the early Filipino engaged in the practice of sacrifice. The reasons for worshipping this sacrifice and adoration were, in addition to whatever personal matters there might be, the recovery of a sick person, the prosperity voyage of the embarking of the sea, a good harvest in the sowed lands, a propitious results in war, a successful delivery in childbirth, and a happy outcome in married life.
Excerpt from the Sucesos de las Islas Filipinas by Antonio D. Morga. The third primary source that describes the religious practices of the early Filipinos comes from the excerpt of the Sucesos by Antonio D. Morga. He was a Spanish high-ranking official in the Philippines. His book Sucesos covers the political, economic, social and cultural life of the Filipinos and Spaniards. This work was based on documentary research as well as Morga's personal involvement and observation. This was possible due to his position in the colonial government. The work became more popular when Jose Rizal annotated and critiqued the book in 1890. In the excerpt of the Successes that follows, Morga talks about the ignorance and stubbornness of the non-Christian Filipinos. As Morga describes, in matters of religion, the natives proceeded more barbarously and with greater blindness than in all the rest. For beside being pagans without any knowledge of the true God, they neither strove to discover him by way of reason. The devil usually deceived them with 1,000 errors and blindness. He appeared to them in various horrible and frightful forms, so that they feared him and trembled before him. They generally worshipped him and made images of him in the said forms. These they kept in caves and private houses, where they offered them perfumes and odors, and food and fruit, calling them anitos. They had no priests or religious affairs, except certain old men and women called katalunas, and the Bisayans called them babaylan. These were experienced witches and sorcerers, who kept the other people deceived. The people of the community communicated to the sorcerers their desires and needs, and the Katalunas told them innumerable extravagancies and lies. The Katalunas uttered prayers and performed other ceremonies to the idols for the sick, and they believed in omens and superstitions, with which the devil inspired them, whereby they declared whether the patient would recover or die. Social structure.
Excerpt from Labor Evangelica of the Government and Political Costumes of These People by Francisco Colin. So we will now present the social structure during the pre-Hispanic Philippines. So the primary source that we will be exploring first is an excerpt from the document written by Francis Colin titled Labor Evangelica of the Government and Political Costumes of These People. In his Labor Evangelica, the most studied groups are the Tagalogs and the Visayans. He describes them as their social structure as follows. So there were no kings or rulers worthy of mention throughout the archipelago, but there were many chiefs who dominated other less powerful. As there were many without much power, there were no security from the continual wars that were waged between them. So the same conditions ruled in all the rest of the islands and of even the whole archipelago until the entrance of the faith, when they were given peace without their now esteem, which they now esteem much more than all that they then obtained from those petty wars and those depredations. So they were divided into barangays, as Roma into districts, and our cities into parishes or collations. So they are called barangays, which is the name of a boat, preserving the name from the boat in which they came to settle in these islands, since they came subject to one leaders in their barangays who acted their captain or pilot, who was accompanied by his children, relatives, friends, and comrades. After landing, they kept in company under the leader, who is the dato. Seizing the lands, they began to cultivate them and to make use of them. There are three kinds of classes of people: the chiefs, whom the Visayans called Dato, and the Tagalogs Maginoo, the Timawas, who are the ordinary people called Maharlika among the Tagalogs, and the slave called Oripon by the Visayans and Alipin by the Tagalogs. The chief attained the position generally through their blood, or if not that, because of their energy and strength. This is there is no superior who gives him authority or title beyond his own efforts and power. Consequently, might was proclaimed as right, and he was robbed, and he who robbed most and tyrannized most was the most powerful.
Excerpt from the Sucesos de las Islas Filipinas by Antonio D. Morga. The second primary source in the discussion of social structure in pre-Hispanic Filipino society is from the Sucesos. Morga described the social structure of the Philippines as follows. There are three conditions of persons among the natives of these islands, and into which their government is divided. First the chiefs, second the timagwas, and lastly the slaves of those both chiefs and timagwas. The slaves were of several classes. Some were for all kinds of work and slavery. Such are called sagigiliris. They serve inside the house, as did likewise the children born of them. There are others who live in their own houses with their families, outside the house of their lord. These are bound to come to their lord's house whenever he summons them, and to serve in these offices without any pay or stipend. These slaves are called namamahais, and their children and descendants are slaves of the same class. These slaves comprise the greatest wealth and capital of these natives of these islands, for they are very useful to them and necessary for the cultivation of their property. Government and political customs. In regards to the discussion of the government and political customs of pre-Hispanic Filipinos, we will look at the excerpt from Lación de las Islas Filipinas by Miguel de Loarca. Miguel de Loarca was one of the first conquistadores to arrive in the Philippines, wherein he observed the traditions of the natives before they were converted to Catholic faith. The following are the excerpts from their Relaciones, 9th chapter, that talks about the loss of slavery in the Visayas. According to Loarca, no Indian in this country is made a slave or is put to death for any crime which he commits, even if it be theft, adultery, or murder, except that for each crime there is an established fine, which they have to pay in jewels or gold, and if the culprit is unable to pay the fine, he will borrow the money, and pledge himself to the man from whom he borrows. As a result, he becomes a slave, until he shall repay what was lent to him. After that he is free again. Therefore, according to the crimes committed, they are slaves, and there are three classes of slaves in these islands. The first and most thoroughly enslaved is the bondman of him who served in his own dwelling. Such a slave they call a Louie. These slaves work 3 days for the master and 1 for themselves. Another class of slaves are those called tumaranpuk. They live in their own houses and are obliged to go to work for their master 1 day out of 4, having the 3 days for themselves. There are other slaves whom these people hold in most respect, who are called tumatabans. These work in the house of the master only when there is some banquet or revel. On such occasions they bring small gifts and share in the drinking. But when one of these slaves dies, the property left by the slave is shared with his children by the master. During their lifetime, these slaves are bound to work for their master 5 days in a month, or if they do not work, they annually give the master 5 chicobits of rice.
So, excerpt from Sucesos de las Islas Filipinas by Antonio D. Morga. So, according to Morga, there were no kings or lords throughout these islands who ruled over them as in the mariner of other kingdoms and provinces. But in every island and each province of it, many chiefs were recognized by the natives themselves, so some were more powerful than the others, and each had his followers and subjects by district and families, and those obeyed and respected the chiefs. So some chiefs had friendship and communication with others at times of wars and quarrels. So these principalities and lordship were inherited in the male line and by succession of father and son and their descendants. So if these were lacking, so then their brothers and collateral relatives succeeded. Their duty was to rule and govern their subjects and followers and to assist them in their interests and necessities. In regards to the laws of the Filipinos, Marga describes them as follows. So the natives' laws throughout the islands were based on the traditions and customs of their ancestors without anything being written. Some provinces had different customs than the other in some respects. However, they agreed in most, and in all the islands, generally the same usage were followed. Excerpt from Labor Evangelica of the Government and Political Customs of These People by Francisco Colin. So their laws and policies, which were not very barbarous to barbarians, consisted wholly of traditions and costumes, observed with so great exactness that it was not considered possible to break them in any circumstance. One was the respect of parents and elders, so carried to so great the individuals, even the children, must follow the general costume.
In summary, we've discussed the three aspects of pre-Hispanic Filipino society, namely their religion, their social classes, their government and political customs. On matters of religion, we've discussed the work of Pedro Chirino, Fray Juan de Plasencia, and Antonio de Morga. On matters of social classes, we've discussed the works of Antonio de Morga and Francisco Colin. And lastly, in the matters of government and political customs, we've discussed the work of Antonio de Morga, Francisco Colin, and lastly, Miguel de Loarca. So this is the custom of Filipino pre-Hispanic society. Thank you all for listening.